In the shadow-draped town of Raven's Hollow, a place where fog clings to the cobblestones like a shroud, residents whispered of its eerie past, retelling tales that blurred the line between myth and reality. Among these, the story of Cora Langley, a reclusive artist with a shadowy history, stood out for its chilling layers of fear and mystery. Cora lived alone in an ancient mansion at the edge of the forest, a towering structure of weathered stone and ivy-clad walls that many believed was haunted. The mansion, inherited from a lineage of eccentric ancestors, held countless rooms filled with dark corners and secrets. Cora's life was quiet, her days filled with painting and her nights consumed by the haunting melodies she played on her old piano. One foggy evening, a series of unsettling events began to unfold. It started with a painting, one Cora had been working on for weeks, a portrait of a woman whose eyes seemed almost lifelike, compelling anyone who looked at them to feel a deep, inexplicable sorrow. That night, as the clock struck midnight, a soft, sorrowful sobbing echoed through the halls, the sound emanating from the room where the painting was displayed. Cora, awakened by the noise, descended the grand staircase, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and curiosity. As she approached the painting, the sobbing grew louder, more desperate. Just as she reached out to touch the canvas, the front door of the mansion slammed shut, startling her. A cold wind swept through the hall, extinguishing all the candles except one, which flickered ominously. Shaken, Cora turned to retreat to her room, but stopped dead in her tracks at the sight of muddy footprints leading from the front door to the base of the stairs. They were large, uneven, and appeared only seconds old. Fear clenched at her throat as she followed the trail with her eyes, each step echoing in the silent house. Deciding to confront whatever or whoever had invaded her home, Cora retrieved a heavy candlestick as a makeshift weapon and followed the muddy trail. It led her to the library, a room filled with ancient books and manuscripts. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and inside, she found the window wide open, curtains billowing in the cold breeze. The room was otherwise empty. Relief washed over her for a moment until she heard a rustling behind her. Whirling around, candlestick raised, she faced not a man, but a shadow. It seemed almost solid, a darker patch of darkness that moved with purpose. It wasn't cast by anything, yet it moved towards her, its form occasionally flickering with the semblance of human features. Cora stepped back, her mind racing. The shadow seemed to hesitate, then advanced more quickly. In a panic, Cora swung the candlestick through the shadow, expecting no resistance, but to her shock, the candlestick connected with something solid. A guttural growl filled the room, and the shadow recoiled, shrinking back towards the window. Heart-pounding, Cora edged around the room to escape, but the shadow darted forward, blocking her path. It was then that the portrait's eyes flashed in her mind, those sorrowful, lifelike eyes. A realization dawned on her, chilling her to the bone. The shadow was connected to the portrait, perhaps a manifestation of the painted woman's spirit. With no other choice, Cora dashed towards the library's fireplace, grabbing a burning log. She brandished the flaming wood like a torch, thrusting it towards the shadow. The room filled with an ear-piercing shriek as the shadow retreated, its form disintegrating under the assault of light and fire. Breathing heavily, Cora watched as the shadow vanished completely, the room falling silent once more. She dropped the log back into the fireplace, her hands trembling. The immediate danger had passed, but the night's horrors were far from over. As dawn broke over Raven's Hollow, Cora sat in her studio, staring at the unfinished portrait. The woman's eyes seemed to gaze back at her with a new intensity, a silent plea evident in their depths. Cora knew then that the night's events were only the beginning of what was to unfold. The connection between the portrait and the shadowy manifestation needed to be understood, and she feared what discoveries might lie ahead. Outside, the first light of morning did little to dispel the thick fog that clung to the grounds of the mansion. As Cora contemplated her next move, a knock sounded at the door, slow and deliberate. A new visitor? Or something far more sinister, drawn to the mansion by the night's dark events? Continued from previous segment, Cora rose slowly, her body stiff from the night's ordeals. The knock repeated, each thud against the old wood of her door echoing like a drumbeat in the quiet morning. Her heart raced as she approached, every fiber of her being screaming that the nightmare was not yet over. With a trembling hand, she reached for the door and pulled it open. The fog poured in like smoke from an extinguished fire, thick and nearly palpable, obscuring her view of the figure standing on her doorstep. It was a man, his features vague and indistinct through the mist, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about his presence. "Can I help you?" Cora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped forward, his features becoming clearer as he emerged from the fog. He was elderly, his face lined with age and eyes that held a depth of sadness, or was it malice? Cora couldn't tell. He wore a long, tattered coat and held a hat in his hands, twisting it nervously. "I need to speak with you, Miss Langley," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "It's about the painting. The one you're working on." Cora felt a chill run down her spine. "How do you know about my paintings?" she asked, her suspicion rising. "I've been aware of your work for some time," the man replied evasively. "Please, may I come in? It's urgent." Reluctantly, Cora stepped aside, allowing him entry. The man moved past her, his gaze lingering on the walls lined with Cora's paintings as if searching for something. When his eyes finally landed on the portrait of the woman with sorrowful eyes, he stopped. "This is the one," he said, pointing. "This is why I'm here." Cora watched him warily. "What about it?" The man turned to face her, his eyes grave. "This woman, the one you've painted, she was my wife." Shock coursed through Cora. I didn't know her. I just imagined her," she stammered, confusion clouding her thoughts. "No," the man said firmly. "You didn't imagine her. She was real, and she died tragically many years ago. And now, it seems she has returned through your painting." The room seemed to spin around Cora as she processed his words. How could her brushstrokes, guided by her own hand, have conjured the likeness of someone she had never met? "What do you want from me?" Cora asked, a sense of dread building within her. "I need you to help me free her spirit," the man said. "She is trapped, bound to this world by some unfinished business. I believe your painting has somehow bridged a gap between her and the living." Cora felt the weight of the man's request. It was madness, yet after the horrors of the previous night, she could not dismiss it outright. "How can I help?" she asked tentatively. "You must finish the painting," he replied. "Complete it, and perhaps it will give her the peace she needs to move on." The task seemed insurmountable, but as Cora glanced at the portrait, the woman's eyes seemed to plead with her for release. With a heavy heart, she agreed to the man's request. The next few days were a blur as Cora worked tirelessly on the portrait, the old man watching her every stroke with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The eyes of the woman in the painting followed her, sorrowful and knowing, as if aware of their nearing fate. As Cora added the final touches, a storm began to brew outside, the wind howling like the cries of the damned. The house creaked and moaned under the strain of the gale, and the lights flickered ominously. Just as Cora stepped back to view the completed painting, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Thunder roared, shaking the windows, and for a moment, the world was nothing but shadows and noise. Then, as quickly as it had gone, the power flickered back to life. Cora turned back to the painting, her breath catching in her throat. The woman's expression had changed, where there was once endless sorrow, there was now a semblance of peace. But the room was not empty. Standing beside the painting was the silhouette of a woman, her form ethereal and shimmering with an otherworldly light. The old man stood beside her, his hand reaching out to hers. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The figures looked at each other, their hands nearly touching, and then turned to look at Cora, gratitude evident in their spectral eyes. But as the scene before her seemed to reach a resolution, the wind outside grew fiercer and the house shuddered under its force. The ethereal woman and the old man seemed to struggle against an unseen force, their forms flickering like candle flames in a tempest. The air in the room thickened, heavy with a charge that made the hair on Cora's arms stand on end. The painting, now seemingly alive, pulsed with a strange, luminescent glow. The colors swirled on the canvas, no longer confined by their outlines, creating a mesmerizing but terrifying spectacle. Cora felt an overwhelming sense of dread as the atmosphere around her seemed to warp and twist. "Quickly, we don't have much time," the old man shouted over the howl of the wind, his voice urgent and fearful. "Something has been unleashed." Cora, rooted to the spot in fear, watched as the figures in the room began to distort, their features elongating and twisting into grotesque versions of themselves. The pleasant expression on the ethereal woman's face turned into a mask of agony, and her eyes, so much like those in the painting, pleaded for release. "Help us," she cried, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to bounce off the walls of the mansion. But before Cora could move or speak, a dark shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, gliding over the floor, absorbing light and warmth as it expanded. The temperature dropped sharply, and Cora's breath became visible in the air, her exhales forming misty clouds in the frigid atmosphere. The shadow enveloped the ethereal woman and the old man, their cries of terror cutting through the din of the storm. The old man reached out towards Cora, his expression one of desperation and warning. "Banish it," he screamed. "The amulet! Use the amulet!" Cora's eyes darted around the room in panic, searching for anything that might resemble an amulet. Her gaze landed on a small, antique box on the mantelpiece, one she had never dared to open, left behind by her ancestors who had once dabbled in the occult. With no time to hesitate, she rushed to the box, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the latch. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a dusty silver amulet, its gemstone center pulsating with a dim light. Barely understanding her actions but driven by instinct, Cora snatched the amulet and held it out towards the shadow. The amulet vibrated in her hand, a hum of power building within it, resonating with the storm's fury. "By the light and darkness, I command thee, banish!" Cora shouted, her voice steadier than she felt. The words came to her as if whispered by the winds themselves. The amulet emitted a blinding light, piercing the shadow. A howl, louder and more agonizing than the storm, erupted from the entity as it recoiled, the light seemingly burning it. The shadow thinned, breaking into wisps of darkness that dissipated into the air, chased away by the luminescence of the amulet. The room fell silent, the storm outside abating as suddenly as it had begun. The ethereal woman and the old man, now freed from the shadow's grasp, smiled at Cora with ethereal gratitude. Their forms started to fade, becoming less and less tangible until they were nothing but a memory. Cora collapsed to the floor, the amulet falling from her limp hand. Exhaustion enveloped her, her mind struggling to process the night's supernatural events. As she lay there, the mansion quiet once more, a chilling realization crept into her weary brain: the shadow had been banished, but not destroyed. The house creaked ominously, the silence now a foreboding echo of the chaos that had just subsided. In the deep recesses of the mansion, something stirred, a soft, sinister whisper that promised the shadow was not gone, merely retreated to the shadows from whence it came. As dawn crept over Raven's Hollow, the first light of day casting long shadows across the floor of the library, Cora knew that the battle was far from over. The amulet, still glowing faintly on the floor beside her, was a testament to the power she had unleashed in the darkness that awaited its chance to rise again. Continued from previous segment, the light of dawn filtered weakly through the heavy curtains of the library, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed almost to writhe on the dusty floor. Cora, her energy nearly spent, pushed herself up to a sitting position, the events of the night replaying in her mind like a macabre film. The amulet lay beside her, its glow dimming yet still pulsating with a faint, mysterious light. Exhausted but unable to rest, Cora picked up the amulet, feeling its residual warmth. The whispers that had filled the mansion seemed to have fallen silent with the coming of the light, but she knew better than to think they were gone forever. They had merely retreated, biding their time until darkness fell again. The realization that the shadow was still linked to her home, perhaps even drawn to the amulet itself, filled her with a cold dread. Determined to understand the full extent of the danger she now faced, Cora decided to delve deeper into her family's history. The mansion had always been a place of secrets, and it was time to uncover them. She made her way to the attic, a place she seldom visited, where generations of her ancestors had stored their most personal possessions and, possibly, the keys to understanding the current haunting. The attic was cluttered with trunks and boxes, each covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. As she opened each one, she found old photographs, letters, and artifacts, a tapestry of her family's long and tumultuous history. In a small, locked trunk hidden beneath a tattered Victorian dress, she discovered a journal belonging to her great-great-grandmother Edith Langley, also a reputed medium in her time. The journal was filled with entries about spiritual encounters and detailed accounts of dealing with various entities. Cora's eyes widened as she came upon a section that described a very similar shadow entity, one that Edith had encountered and temporarily banished using an amulet identical to the one Cora now possessed. The entry warned of the shadow's persistence and malice, and the conditions under which it would return. Armed with this new knowledge, Cora understood that the shadow was not just a random manifestation but possibly a cursed entity bound to her family, drawn back into the world through her own actions with the painting. The realization was overwhelming, and Cora felt the weight of her ancestors' battles bearing down on her. As night began to fall once more, Cora prepared herself. She could not leave her ancestral home, not only because it was her heritage, but because she felt it was her responsibility to confront and banish the shadow once and for all. She gathered the journal, the amulet, and every piece of occult knowledge the attic had yielded. As the sun set, the mansion seemed to grow in anticipation, the walls themselves whispering secrets long kept. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves as if mourning an impending tragedy. Cora sat up in the main hall, where the portrait still hung, its subject's eyes now closed as if in peace. The clock struck midnight, and the house fell eerily silent. Then, the temperature dropped, breaths turning to mist, and a darkness began to seep through the walls, thicker and more oppressive than night alone. The amulet in Cora's hand began to glow fiercely, its light a beacon in the encroaching gloom. She could feel the shadow's presence, a suffocating evil that sought to extinguish her light. Cora stood her ground, chanting incantations from Edith's journal, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her heart. The shadow formed before her, a swirling mass of darkness, its power palpable as it faced her. The battle of wills was intense, Cora using every piece of arcane knowledge she had learned from the journal. The amulet blazed with radiant light, piercing the shadow, breaking it into fragments that screamed in rage and pain. But each piece seemed to regenerate, pulling together repeatedly, a relentless enemy fueled by centuries of hatred and darkness. As the night wore on, the realization dawned on Cora that this might not be a battle she could win tonight. The shadow was ancient, bound deeply to the spiritual fabric of the mansion. With every chant and every flare of the amulet, she pushed it back, but it was a temporary victory at best. The entity was part of the house, part of her legacy, a curse she might have to face again and again. As dawn approached, the shadow receded once more, beaten back but not destroyed. Cora, exhausted, knew that the respite would be brief. She had held off the darkness for now, but it would return. The mansion stood silent in the early morning light, a sentinel against the darkness, with Cora as its keeper. She realized that her battle was not just about survival but about understanding and possibly breaking a cycle that had ensnared.